All right, I'm gonna show you the steps that I do to construct a foundation paper piece pattern. So I have my paper, I have my fabric pieces pre-cut using that measuring method that I showed previously, and now I am going to start construction. So the first piece of fabric you're going to lay down is for section 1. So this is my fabric for section 1. I'm going to flip the paper over. I like to use you can either use glue stick or you can pin for this part, but you want to make sure that you have your starting fabric placed in the right spot. So I use a glue stick. I'll just put a dot of glue kind of in the center of the block. You can kind of hold it up a little bit and see where the edges are. I'll just put a dot of glue right in the center. If you're using patterned fabric, a right side and a wrong side, you want to make sure the right side is up. And then I have this desk lamp that's really bright, and I place my fabric making sure that there is space on all edges. You can see there's space all around each edge, so that's good. Put that down. Now since I just placed one, I'm going to sew on part 2. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. The way I do it is using a light, or you can use a window. Other people, they'll fold along this line, trim, and then you can match up seams. I don't like to do that extra step, so that's why I use my light instead. So again, I'm going to hold up my piece of fabric, my paper, and my fabric behind it. I'm going to get my other piece of fabric, my fabric 2. I'm making sure that I'm placing right sides together on the fabric. So the original fabric is up, so this one's going to be down. And then I line it up to make sure that I have at least a 1/4 inch over the seam line on all edges. Just like that. So now I can either pin it if I want to, or I just take it straight to my sewing machine. Again, I have reduced my stitch length. And I want to make sure I lock both ends of the stitch. I'm going to stitch along this line. I'm going to extend out into the seam allowance on both sides, just to really lock down the seam all the way across. All right, so now I've sewn all the way across on that second line. Again, I went all the way into the seam allowance on both sides. Now I'm going to flip it over. You can see I have here, but I have more than a 1/4 inch on the seam allowance. So I want to make sure I trim that so I don't have lots of extra bulk. So flipping to the front, I can just fold this over at the seam line. I'll take my ruler, line up the edge of the paper at my 1/4 inch mark, and then cut down this line, just like so. Now I have a good smaller 1/4 inch. Now I'm going to take this to my iron and I'm going to press it open. All right, so I have it pressed open. I always like to double check here and flip it up and look in my light to make sure that I don't have any gaps, like it overlaps all of my seam allowances and I didn't cut wrong or sew too close, and it looks like I'm good. So now I get to move. I finished sewing 1 to 2. Now I sew on number 3. This is my fabric. So again, I'm going to flip over. I'm going to place my fabrics right side together. I'm going to use my light and line up on that 3 seam line about a 1/4 inch above it. It's just got to be approximate. All right, there we go. You'll see also, make sure when you get to the edges that you also go a 1/4 inch beyond the edge of where that stops for the next seam allowance you sew. So now I've got it lined up. I can take it to my sewing machine and sew. All right, so I've sewn the 3 seam line. Again, I went into the seam allowance over here to make sure that I had it tight all the way through. And again, I have lots of extra here. So again, flip it over. and pull it here. You'll notice if you do sew into the seam allowance every time, it might rip the paper some as you're folding this over. That's fine. The paper in general will stay up. So again, line up on the quarter and trim. And now again, we're gonna take this to the iron and press it open. And we have our nice third piece of fabric. All right, I'm going to construct, put on blocks 4 and 5. You do them the exact same way, and I'll come back once I've got part 5 on and pressed open. All right, so I have now sewn all 5 pieces together, again, through the seam allowances, and you can see they look all nice. They've all been pressed open, or pressed out. Now, you would generally trim this block. What I like to do to make sure that I don't accidentally, when I'm sewing 2 blocks together, or 2 units together, and also to make trimming easier without sometimes the fabric moving around. This one, it's less important because the pieces are smaller, but if you're getting into long pieces that may not have as many seams attachments, sometimes the fabric shifts when you're trying to trim the seams. So what I like to do is take this to my sewing machine, and I'm going to use a basting stitch. I use 3.5, and sew within the seam allowance. So between these 2 lines, I'm going to sew a basting stitch all the way around. All right, so now you can see I have a basting stitch. It does not have to be super accurate, just within that seam allowance. And now I can take my ruler and put it right on that outer line of that seam allowance and trim all the way around the block. And here is my finished trimmed block that I can use now to attach more units to it. And the next video will show you how I line up units so that they line up well.